We have three speakers. I will start by introducing Dr. Manuel Morales. He's an associate professor of psychiatry at University of Missouri Kansas City School of Medicine. He's a child and adolescent psychiatrist as well as a psychoanalyst. He graduated from the Peruvian University of Cayetana Heredia in Peru. Then his general psychiatry residency as well as child and adolescent fellowship at Carl Menger School of Psychiatry in Topeka. He also obtained his degree in psychoanalysis from Topeka Institute of Psychoanalysis, where he also serves as a faculty. He has multiple presentations in the field in the field of psychiatry and psychology. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Matthew Brown. He is currently the Chief Medical Officer of Trilogy Behavioral Health in Chicago, Illinois. He attended medical school in Kansas City University College of Osteopathic Medicine, and he finished his residency in general psychiatry at University of Missouri, Kansas City. Sounds familiar. And he did child and adolescent fellowship at the University of Chicago Medical Center. He holds an MBA in healthcare leadership from Ellsberg School of Management, Rockhurst University, Kansas City, Missouri. He is currently an investigator in MDA-focused clinical trials and has several publications and presentations in the field of psychiatry. He is also a member of editorial board of the Journal of Humanistic Psychiatry.
Yeah, that's me. Oh, they're better on me.
I'm on board, editorial.
Oh, you're in the board, okay. Okay, I thought you were jumping into the biography.
I assure you. Our last speaker is Dr. Fernando Espi Forcen.
Yes, sir.
He is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry, Psychosomatic Medicine at Rush University Medical Center, Chicago, Illinois. He is the founding editor of Journal of Humanistic Psychiatry and the author of the book Monsters, Demons, and Psychopaths, a psychiatry and horror film. Dr. Forcen obtained his medical degree from University of Murcia in Spain. At the same university, he read a PhD on the history of psychiatry titled Demons, Past and Death, Mental Health in Late Middle Ages, and was awarded the best PhD in 2014 and 15 academic years. He finished his general psychiatry residency in Metro Health Medical Center, Case Western Reserve University, Cleveland, Ohio. He also finished child and adolescent fellowship from University of Chicago Medical Center and psychosomatic medicine fellowship from Cornell University. He has more than 20 peer-reviewed publications in a variety of aspects of psychiatry, such as akathisia, to drugs, metabolic syndrome, inflammation, dissociative symptoms, history of psychiatry and cinema. He's also a reviewer in the American Journal of Psychiatry, as well as several other journals. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
All right, thank you very much for coming this morning. We're going to try to accomplish this presentation in 50 minutes. So we kind of going to rush a little bit, so we have time for questions. I don't know how many of you are familiar with R.D. Lane. He was in the 50s, 60s, well known back then, a psychoanalyst I think he's Scottish. When he was asked what kind of advice would you give for those wishing to become a psychoanalyst, he answered, number one, read Freud's works. Number two, get into personal psychoanalysis. And number three, take LSD.
We have new objectives for residency now.
So I did the first two, but I am a psychoanalyst now. But I didn't take LSD, but I took ayahuasca. And I'm from Peru, so this is ayahuasca vision by a painter in Peru, Paulo Maringo. And under the influence of ayahuasca, he created paintings like this. So when I was in medical school in Lima, we did a rural internship. So we spent a few months anywhere around the country, and I went to the jungle, and the Dutch government just finished excellent, beautiful hospital with all the technology of those days. That's 40 years plus ago. And I was there, very excited, but I was getting bored. Nobody would come to the hospital, and if anybody would come to the hospital, it would be to die because they were in critical conditions. So I was wondering, where do people go when they get sick? And they told me they go to see the healers, the curanderos. So I said, I want to see the curanderos. So I did, and I spent some time with them, and that's how I learned that he prepares the medications, his medicinal plants in his house, and he gives the medicine himself to his patients, and he fixes this ayahuasca drink, and for treatment of, or for just to experience visions like this. So I was curious, and I did it. And I don't know if you're familiar with ayahuasca, but when you drink that, it creates a gastrointestinal reaction where you start throwing up and vomiting, and it's awful. So I said, I'm not going to do this anymore. And I felt so bad, and it was in the middle of the night. We had a moon out there, but it was, I was feeling really sick. So I went out from the space where we were sitting, and I felt terribly lonely, and suddenly there is a dog sitting next to me. And then I had this amazing communication with this dog. And if you don't know my history, when I was a child, I had terrible experiences with dogs. They were chasing me, and it was a very traumatic experience. So from then on, I felt I'm not afraid of dogs anymore. And in fact, we had such a communication with no words, of course. So that's my experience with ayahuasca. Now, this is something that was found in southern Algeria, in a cave. If you carefully see what's coming out of his skin, assuming that he's a male, can you see what's coming out? What do you see?
Mushrooms.
Mushrooms. You got it. So, and that was 6,000 years ago. Now, this place in Algeria now is the Sahara Desert. But back in those days, it was grasslands. It was, cattle, plants, population, and they domesticated animals, cultivated plants. They had great goddess, and it was what's called the partnership model of human interaction, where men and women are equal. So apparently, this was the Garden of Eden. But unfortunately, for some reason we don't know, cataclysmic natural disasters or invasions from other people, that disappeared. It's now a desert, and people move east, due to the drought. So, I don't know how many of you are aware what's the difference between prehistory and history. I didn't know about it until I was getting ready for this. Most of the time that people has lived on Earth has been during what we call prehistory, and that's thousands of years, if not millions of years. Today, we live during the time period known as history. It's maybe 5,000 years. So when did one end and the other begin? In one word, writing. And when did we know writing start? Was about 3,500 years before Christ in Mesopotamia. Now, it took 5 million years from Homo africanus to become Homo erectus in terms of evolution. Now, from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens took only 1 million years. The difference is amazing. Now, Homo erectus lived with and around their cattle. From simple cave dwelling gatherers, they became farmers and keepers of animals. And as you know, where are cattle, there are cowpaths, and where are cowpaths, there are mushrooms. Mushrooms grow in humidity. So, so people were eating wherever it was available, and so people started, humans began acquainted with mushrooms. So, and this experience with mushrooms would induce a sense of oceanic unity and they get into their inner world. So 1 million years of psilocybin in human evolution, we became a different body with opposing thumbs, bipedalism, binocular vision, throwing arm, and particularly language and spirituality. So language apparently developed not as a means of communications with others, as we use now, but more as a means to hold a personal dialogue with ourselves. So it's an experience with your inner world. That's apparently how it started, that we began to get awareness of what we are doing, for instance, to get something to eat. You know, we started to identify our actions with what it means to us. And so it's how gradually began to put together and develop some, later became externalized speech and communication, but it originally was for internal dialogue. And you can see this in psilocybin neuroimaging, that closing of the eyes, it provides an opening to the inner world of the mind. Now, I'm going to look now to the book of Genesis, the book of Exodus, and the Rig Veda. That's, you know, this is as old as written scriptures that we can find. I mean, there are some Sumerian language that goes back to 3500 before Christ in what's now known as Iraq. But the book of Genesis, for instance, I mean, depends on who you read. It could go back to 600 before Christ or 1200 before Christ. You know, so it's relatively recent, you know, in our time age. So, as you see here in the book of Genesis, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good to eat and that it was pleasing to the eye and pleasing to contemplate, she took and some and ate it. She also gave her husband some and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened and they discovered that they were naked. So they stitched fig leaves together and made themselves loincloth. So, you know, this means that men or mankind, or men and women, began to take awareness of who they are and what they are to be, some self-reflection. But at the same time, as you can see in this paragraph also from the book of Genesis, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. What if he now reaches out his hand and takes fruit from the tree of life, also eats and lives forever? So the Lord God drove him out of the Garden of Eden till the ground from which he had been taken. He cast him out and to the east of the Garden of Eden. He stationed the cherubim and a sword, wielding and flashing to guard the way to the tree of life. So it's like we lost the paradise, right? And but also, as you can see, the woman gets blamed for losing the paradise. And it's not here, but the woman was told by the serpent, go and take that. That will give you wisdom. So this is, I think this is against women, you know, against the female. And if you remember, before, in the prehistory, women were the goddess. I mean, they were on top of the society in the ranking of men and women. Even though it was more of a partnership model, but it was women who were the nutrients, like the earth, Mother Earth. You know, they were, well, you can get something to eat. So that was this was the end of a cultural era and became what we are now. Now, in the book of Exodus, when Moses was telling people to be thankful that we are getting the manna from God, from the heaven, what he was referring as manna, if you see the second paragraph, and when the dew that lay was gone, behold, upon the face of the wilderness, there lay a small round thing. What's that? Small round thing. You know, you can argue that maybe this is a mushroom. And and when the children of Israel saw, if they said one to another, it's the manna, they wist not what it was. And so, you know, this is another hypothetical theory that there's something going on here. Now, if we go and review the Rig Veda, for people who are from India or anybody, is the most, the ancient scriptures, sacred scriptures of Hinduism. And the Rig Veda is the first Veda. And these, they talk about the whole Rig Veda, or most of it, is related to what is Soma. So the cult to Soma is described in the earliest Indo-European spiritual rite in the Vedas. So it was some juice extracted out of the swollen fibers of a plant. Again, there is a plant here. So it's like this deep connection with the plant that somehow, are you good? Somehow we are losing that connection with our vegetable plants, and that can be a source of medicinal power. So, and this can go back, apparently from studies done, it can go back maybe 1700 before Christ. Okay, so this is part of history, not prehistory. So this is written in the ninth mandala Rig Veda. It is drank by the sick man as medicine at sunrise. Partaking of it strengthens the limbs, preserves the legs from breaking, wards off all disease and lengthens life. Then need and trouble vanish away. The poor man in the intoxication of the soma feels himself rich. The draught impels the singer to lift his voice and inspires him for song. It gives the poet supernatural power, so he feels himself immortal. What is this? You know? Now this is another ayahuasca vision by Saint painter Paolo Maringo, the spirit of stones and metals. So there is somebody, and I can give you the sources of my presentation later if you want to, but Terence McKenna has been my main source regarding the history of psilocybin mushrooms. So the psilocybin mushroom gave us thought and thinking, gave us language, and whatever happened, you know, somehow the mushroom psilocybin disappeared from the scene in human history. Why is that? And apparently, you know, because of the changing of seasons and the weather, and they needed to find a way to preserve the mushrooms, and they did that by putting them in honey. And if you put that in honey, that honey is going to get fermented and become what? Alcohol. So that's how we became acquainted with alcohol. And alcohol took over, and then we put the mushrooms behind. So, finish my presentation with, since I'm a psychoanalyst, I have to quote Freud. The future, he said this 1 year before he died. The future might teach us how to exercise a direct influence by means of particular chemical substance upon the neural apparatus. It may be that there are other still undreamed possibilities of therapy.
So thank you, Dr. Morales, for that background of more ancient history of psychedelics. I'm going to transition into more modern Western history when this became a little bit more interesting and researched the first time around before we got to where we are here today. But before we go there, I want to kind of throw out a few words, because of course, like all different areas of study, there's some vocabulary, some terminology. So we're talking about psychedelics, which was coined by Humphrey Osmond in 1956. He was a physicist, meaning mind manifesting. Although there's a couple of different compounds that, or classes of compounds that tend to get lumped together within psychedelics that a few people have tried to kind of piece apart. The first area, or the things that we're most familiar with, would probably be considered more like what's considered the entheogen. So this is came up in 1978, coined by, or sorry, 79 by Gordon Wasson, meaning creating the divine within. So these are the typical more hallucinogenics where you might see God, like have a very transcendent mystical experience. And then there's also a class of compounds called either pathogens or entactogens, which very unlikely are going to have you fully hallucinate, but they create a great sense of empathy. And so typically what we're talking about here, again, the entheogens are more of DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which is the central ingredient in ayahuasca, which Dr. Morales was kind of talking about, psilocybin mushrooms, mescaline, which is normally found in different cactus species, and LSD. And then the entactogens, predominantly, they're more almost like methamphetamine derivatives, really, because they tend to be fairly stimulating. They cause you to, again, have some empathy, openness, no real hallucinations. Then there's also like the dissociative agents, kind of along the lines of ketamine, that has some interaction between the two, but it's not quite the same. But today we're going to be talking about these two broad categories and how they came about in Western culture. So we're going to start actually a little bit forward and then kind of rewind. So in 1938, Albert Hofmann, as a chemist working for Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, looking for a treatment for heart failure. And he was synthesizing a number of molecules from the ergot fungus and came up with LSD. And he had a number of different variations of the LSD compound that he tested. Didn't really see much of it for the heart failure. A lot of it got put on the shelf for about 5 years. Then in 1943, he was going back through and working with some of the compounds that he had previously synthesized. The rumor has it he had like set one on the counter and maybe put his finger on it and was scratching his face. Was doing some work. Then decided to go home for the afternoon because he was feeling kind of funny. And as he was riding his bike home, he started having these just amazing visions, and it was like things were coming at him from all different directions, and he got home and he had to take a long nap, and he didn't know what had happened to him. That was on 4/19, which is now known as Bicycle Day today. Also, then the other the agent within the entheogen area, being psilocybin, was more popularized in Western culture through the work of R. Gordon Wasson, who was an ethnobotanist who was working with a shaman named Maria Sabina down in Mexico. Traditionally, which was interesting because in Mexico there was a little bit of a mushroom culture, but they were much more interested in using salvia there. And so but that's a whole different story. We're going to skip over the psilocybin things. Those are more associated with the Harvard experiments, Walter Pankey, Good Friday, all of that. But we're going to talk a little bit more about, again, here's Albert Hoffman, the LSD, because this was the one that was much, I believe anyway, was a little bit more seriously investigated as a psychotherapeutic and treatment agent through like a typical medical model. So again, after Sandoz figured like, okay, there's something with this LSD stuff, we should probably investigate it. They shipped it off to a number of different universities in Europe. One of them, and I'm blanking on the exact university where he was studying, but Dr. Stanislav Grof was a medical student in Czechoslovakia at the time, and he was enrolled in a study to see like what are the effects of LSD. And he became sort of very, very interested in this compound and ended up doing a good amount of research on it, both there in Europe and then eventually in the United States. In fact, he was the one coined in 1959 who came up with the theory that serotonin might be somewhat involved in brain processes and perhaps would be helpful for depression, which I think is interesting because this is sort of bringing us almost a little bit full circle to like where we kind of came today and then maybe we're getting back to. So anyway, in 1960, in the mid-60s, he was doing his research in Prague, Czechoslovakia. In the late 60s, he was brought over to Maryland. He was the assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University, and then he was the chief psychiatric researcher at the University of Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. For sake of time, I have a little case here, but so one of the things, after he ran a number of subjects, he did about, I think like 3,000 or so at that time. Subsequently, up till today, I believe he said he's run about 10,000 subjects through his LSD trials. He was noticing that it wasn't necessarily the medication itself that was having the primary effect, but there was sort of this interaction, if you will, between we're defining as not just the drug, but also what we call like the set and setting. So what do we mean by set? Set is basically the things that you bring to the experience. So like what is your intention, or why are you there? What are you thinking is going to happen? Also, what are you bringing with you, such as have you taken any other substances at the time that might be interacting with the drug that you're taking? And so more the ideal set would be you're kind of you're trying to do this for a healing purpose. You are very connected with your therapist who's going to guide you through the process. And oftentimes that'll give you a much better outcome, whereas if you are, I don't know, if there's other adulterants in your system, then maybe it'll be a little bit more unpredictable, as well as the setting. So typically when we're thinking of with psychedelics, or at least in popular culture, oftentimes we're thinking of like raves, dance parties. That's a really, really stimulating environment. And I don't know how many of you might have ever experimented with any sort of psychedelics in the past, but or even heard of people who do. But like when you're hallucinating, like bright lights tend to be even brighter. And if you have all of this like input and sounds all over the place, that can become very, very overwhelming, and it could very easily create a negative experience for you. So in a treatment setting, really, it looks much more like the picture on the right, where the person who is getting the medication, they'd be lying down on a couch, they'd have an eye mask on, maybe listening to some calming music, and they'd have like a therapist. Well, in many of the models, they actually have two co-therapists, both male and female. You get into the background of that if we want to, perhaps at the end. So the way that we're using these substances is a little bit different than how one might think about it in popular culture. Like I said, so Dr. Grof was using LSD to treat a variety of different mental illnesses. He had success with depression, anxiety, different trauma, PTSD, bipolar disorder, some psychotic things. Like I said, at that time, about 3,000 patients he had run through into the 1960s. He did find out that there are indeed some dangers associated with using substances like this. Predominantly, if you have any kind of hypertension, these can increase blood pressure, and that would be problematic. Or if you're using an antidepressant, you already have extra serotonin in your system. Many of these agents dramatically release serotonin all throughout your system, so you run risk of getting serotonin syndrome. These are not absolute contraindications, but serious mental illnesses are much, much, much more difficult to treat, which is maybe not surprising because like this is the case in general psychiatry anyway. So bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, different personality disorders, it's highly recommended that you have very, very good trained therapist who is doing this work to be able to navigate whatever comes up there, because there's going to be lots of personal narrative things probably that come up. Also, another rare side effect that's not necessarily only associated with psychedelics, but is this thing called HPPD, or hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. This is kind of what we think about when we're talking about flashbacks. But basically, this is if you have a time where you have a hallucinatory experience, then just you get back in everyday life, you might every once in a while have that happen. It just keeps happening. But again. There's some association with psychedelic use, but this can happen even if you've never used psychedelics before. So that's kind of interesting. And the prevalence of that it's there, roughly a few percent. The biggest danger, though, is this concept of like getting stuck. So what tends to happen is people tend to start to open up and process a lot of their unconscious fears, desires, different, like, again, traumas that have happened. And if you start to kind of get into that, and then you get scared, and then you feel like you can't deal with this anymore, and you kind of just shut down. After the experience, if you haven't fully processed that unconscious thing that came up, it can start just sort of plaguing you in your everyday life, and you'll just have to kind of deal with that until such time that you go through some more intensive psychotherapy, have another psychedelic experience, or process it some other way. Again, this was the most difficult patient Dr. Groff had seen. I'm going to skip through this for now. So anyway, he was doing his research in Maryland for a few years, but unfortunately that got cut short by the Nixon administration when they passed the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act in 1970. So what was that? This is where we get our schedules from. They created Schedule 1 through 5, and it also caused the formation of the DEA and the FDA. But what was this really about? I mean, they were saying this was for safety because, Schedule 1 substances, they're just things for abuse. They have no medical use whatsoever. But in a quote, I don't have the year of this, but this was not all that long ago, but John Ehrlichman, one of Nixon's former domestic policy advisor, and this is his quote, he said, so you know what this was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968, the Nixon White House after that, had two primary enemies, the anti-war left and black people. So you understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against war or to be black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could then arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So really, this whole scheduling thing and the war on drugs was a big political ploy to kind of help the Nixon administration and continue the war in Vietnam, and had nothing to do with mental health or public safety, which is very unfortunate. Rewinding completely, prior to even when LSD was discovered, we're jumping over to MDMA. MDMA was first synthesized by Merck Pharmaceuticals in the early 19-teens to try to stop abnormal bleeding associated with, I think it was menstrual cycles. Didn't really go too much anywhere. It was studied in the military for a little bit. And then eventually, a chemist from Dow Chemicals, Sasha Shulgin, synthesized this in 1965. He didn't really do much with this. He was a chemist. He liked to create lots of different compounds. Eventually, he gave the recipe to one of his colleagues in Los Angeles, who started making this, and it kind of became a hit in like an underground circle. And then finally a few years later, Shulgin tried it, and he talks about how it had this weird amphetamine-like content, and he really liked it. It had this feeling of just warmth and happiness. You call it his low-calorie martini to kind of take. So in the 1970s, predominantly, MDMA was used as an adjunct to psychotherapy by Leo Zeff. Did I talk about whatever? And he spread this around the country. But not just with therapy, this kind of got picked up by a lot of dance clubs. And when you think about it, again, 1980s, dance club culture, I'm speculating a little bit here, but there's, again, thinking about the theme of prejudice and trying to sort of vilify different individual groups. This was large in the homosexual community. I believe that has something to do with a lot of the, the political trying to schedule this. So in 1985, because people were happy and dancing, and some people got some hypothermia, they decided to place MDMA in the emergency Schedule 1 status. In the summer of 1985, there were some hearings headed by, well, one of the primary people who was trying to speak at the hearings against this emergency scheduling was a Harvard professor, Dr. Lester Grinspoon, talking about the immense benefits they've had with psychotherapy and saying that, this is not a Schedule 1 substance. We really should have this in Schedule 3. We agreed we should regulate this, but we need to study this because it seems to have some dramatic benefits for patients. So that didn't really work, but then finally they ended up suing the DEA because they kept it in Schedule 1. The court system reversed and brought it back to Schedule 3, yet somehow, and I was looking through the literature, I haven't figured out exactly what, I think it was just sort of like this guy John Law, and he just sort of unilaterally, the DEA said, nah, it's Schedule 1. So a month later he put it back in Schedule 1, and that's where it stayed. Then in 1986, the US DEA started to push for the international scheduling of MDMA to make it internationally prohibited. And any potential for research was largely stopped here. I say, well, sort of. Interesting, out of this, a group is formed called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, that has, since the early 1980s, been trying to kind of play the long game of getting MDMA, not just rescheduled, but looked at seriously as a very, very strong pharmacological agent that we can use in conjunction with psychotherapy to treat, they've been studying PTSD, but a number of different disorders. They're about to start their phase 3 clinical trial here, like in early summer, and after that, we're thinking that'll be done by about 2020. If they have positive outcomes like they've had in phase 1 and phase 2, then automatically the DEA will be kind of forced to reschedule MDMA and will be able to prescribe it, although there's going to be some caveats to that. But this is one of the reasons why learning about these substances is exceptionally important, because I think that we're not really taught this, or at least I know I didn't have the opportunity of learning about these substances when I was in training, and it's very likely that we're going to be faced with possibly using these things, and we should know what we're using when we're using it. So anyway, research was largely stopped. It was declining over time. The beginning of the resurgence of research in the scientific community can, at least I would say, in the United States, be traced back to this gentleman, Dr. Rick Strassman, at the University of New Mexico. During the early 1990s, he took about 60 healthy volunteers who had previous experiences with psychedelic substances and injected IV DMT to look at both safety profile and also try to investigate the subjective experience that those people had. This denotes, I'm sort of denoting as like the very, very beginnings, because this was it kind of gained steam over time as he published his papers that started the psychedelic renaissance. And if you look at the the effects of the Controlled Substances Act, this was done by this little graph was done by the Beckley Foundation in the United Kingdom. So these are the published research studies worldwide, and this is just specifically about psilocybin, actually. But if you can see, like in the 1950s, like going up to the 1970, like about 1970, we were getting a huge incline, and then all of a sudden the Controlled Substances Act comes in, huge, like dip, and then in the early 2000s, we start to have a resurgence. I would like to explain what's going on. I'm going to skip through a lot of these, but to get to the point, there are, that slide didn't render right. Okay, so the point is that what's happening here is it seems to be that the substances in and of themselves are not necessarily the thing doing the work. They're much more of a catalyst to sort of unlock something that we have natively in our systems. as evidenced by you don't actually have to take a psychedelic compound to have a psychedelic experience. Different groups have been utilizing different techniques for thousands of years, such as like the sun ceremony, where Native Americans put like hooks, literally hooks, in their chest to create great pain, and they would be dehydrated for a while in the sun. They would start to hallucinate. Sweat lodges. One of my personal favorite things, sensory deprivation tanks. It's just water, salt in it, float in it. You can't feel anything, can't see anything. You lay in there long enough, you're bound to start to, it's very mild, but you'll kind of like see things even though there's nothing to see there because it's pitch black. Different breathing techniques, and intense meditation. Granted, like all of these things are much more difficult to do rather than just taking a pill or something like that, where you'll definitely have the experience, but I think are worth studying and probably the way to go. But it's useful to keep in mind that the substances, it's kind of like a shortcut, or maybe if you want to think of it as like training wheels to sort of show you what you might be trying to approximate when you're doing your regular practice. And now to explain a little bit more about like what's actually going on from like within the brain and some of the more recent studies, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Espi to talk about that.
Thank you, Dr. Brown and Dr. Morales, for this presentation. Since Dr. Morales opened up, I'm going to open up as well. I had an experience with psilocybin. I tried the mushrooms. Since I was a child, I had my little trauma that my mother passed away when I was 11 years old. And I had this existential death anxiety, like what's the meaning of life? What's the meaning of this? And that got me through psychiatry, I want to do psychiatry, I want to do medicine, I want to study neuroscience, I want to study psychology, and I want to study what's the meaning of this. And since then, I've always been very interested in neuroscience. And when I tried the mushrooms, I experienced my own death. I closed my eyes, I would put the music, I did the way they say you can have the entogenic experience. I felt I was experiencing my own death, and I was reconciling with my family and saying, well, it's going to be okay. And since then, my death anxiety or my existential anxiety was the meaning of this life, and what do I have to do here has decreased, and I feel kind of like calmer about it. So I think there is a psychological experience that comes with it, and Dr. Brown has talked about all these psychotherapeutic techniques, and this is unique for everyone. So I just wanted to share this experience. And after this, now we're going to focus about the neuroscience and the clinical trials, which is something that I've been reading about and I've been interested in doing more research about. So as we know, the psychedelics, especially the psilocybin and the LSD, can cause what they call entogenic experiences, and that means that you can have visual changes and visual perceptions. Sometimes they describe it as hallucinations or illusions, hallucinosis, depending on what kind of phenomenology you want to try. And there is a study where we're using the BOLT techniques that they measure the amount of oxygen that is going to several parts of the brain. And they found that, the occipital cortex, they had more oxygen for people who were experiencing the hallucinations. This is a study done with healthy volunteers with MRIs. And they found that the people that, this is for the pointer, okay, in the occipital, here, okay. The occipital cortex, for people who had these visual changes, people who reported the visual changes, they had increased oxygen in the occipital area, which is of course the area for visualization and for vision. And the people who experience an ego dissolution, sometimes people who have mushrooms or psychedelics, they can experience that their ego joins the ego of everyone. Like you experience an ego dissolution, and that we all are part of the same thing. So these people who were experiencing this ego dissolution had decreased blood flow in these areas, in the retrospinal cortex. So we had the spinal cortex here, so it was this little functional area here. The parahippocampus, so we had the hippocampus here, so this area next to the hippocampus, and the medial prefrontal cortex. So these areas are thought to, especially these two areas are related to our reptilian brain, and it's common in all animals as well, and since reptile to mammals. And these areas are areas that are help us know where we are as opposed to the world, right? So I'm here, and you can have a vision of a space and situate yourself as opposed to the world. So there was a decrease of oxygen in this area. So this is also interesting for consciousness studies. We were talking before about consciousness. What is consciousness? We're trying to figure this out. What is the neuroscience of consciousness? What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to be consciously alive? And through these experiences, mystical experiences, a person can experience altered states of consciousness where you can perceive the other, if there is an other. And this is something that intuitively in philosophy has been discussed since Plato. We are always trying to figure out all the history of philosophy. People argue that there are footnotes from Plato Socratic dialogues, where we're trying to figure out, is there anything else? And if there's anything else, how can we conceptualize the other, something else? Something that Kant called the nominal world, or the nominal existence. That is the existence that is not perceivable by our senses. We know that our senses are limited. So this is what, as human beings throughout evolution, we've been trying to figure out, and since we have the first philosophical writings, we've always tried to figure out, and even neuroscientists, we haven't been able to figure out what is consciousness, and it's something that we are trying to elucidate. And I think these studies with psychedelics can be helpful to have a better understanding of the consciousness. Also, with psilocybin, people can experience enhanced creativity. Actually, in California, some people take it to say, well, after I take it, I feel that my ideas are more connected. I was able to connect ideas from the past to current things that I'm doing in my life, and I become more creative after that. And actually, what they found with magnetogram studies is that there is more neuronal firing when you're taking the mushrooms, under the state of the mushrooms. So this would be the placebo person, this would be a person taken under the state of the mushroom, and there is more neuronal firing. So there is a theory that you may open new pathways in your neurons, and this is still hypothetical, but this would enhance this sense of creativity, that after you take a session of mushrooms, you get to an understanding, not only for psychotherapy, because in psychotherapy, people argue when you were using this in psychoanalysis or in LSD psychotherapy, that you could get a better understanding of yourself. Almost like you could do 10 sessions in one session, or 1 year of psychotherapy in only one session, and people have this feeling, if you're able to process this with an analyst and a therapist, but also for creativity. People who are creative, Steve Jobs, for example, he said that part of the ideas that he had is after having experiences with mushrooms. Also, we know that this is, can be helpful from a psychiatric point of view for the treatment of mood and anxiety. When people take the mushroom, they say, I was feeling really good, and after that I feel calmer about my anxieties and my worries. So what's going on in the brain? First, we think these drugs are serotonergic, like Dr. Brown was commenting. And also, what we found is that we have two studies, actually. In one study, this is the one I mentioned here, 2015, they found that in healthy volunteers, people had a decreased sense of anxiety, a calmness feeling. Those people who had a decreased reactivity in the amygdala. So they found decreased reactivity in the amygdala, and these people, they didn't have anxiety disorders, but they were feeling that less anxious, and they had less worries. And they have a decrease in anxiety, not in a pathological anxiety, and this was correlated to decreased activity in the amygdala. And there is another study that came out this year by Qatar Harris group, that what they found is that the decrease of activity in the anxiety was correlated in patients with treatment-resistant depression. It was correlated to the improvement. So people who reported improvement on the psychedelic, in the MRI, they found decreased reactivity in the amygdala. Other studies have found increased reactivity, but the studies that have been clinically meaningful have found a decreased reactivity in the amygdala. We know the amygdala is very important in anxiety, in the fight, flee, or freeze response, is very important in PTSD. There is a lot of firing of the amygdala that triggers the symptoms of PTSD. And even in catatonia. Catatonia, all the neuroscience now in catatonia is trying to pay attention to some areas of the brain, the temporal lobe as well, some areas in the frontal cortex and the basal ganglia, but also in the amygdala, because the amygdala plays this freeze response that could be explain some of the pathophysiology and the symptoms that you get in catatonia. And have we tried this clinically, since a lot of people perceive it can be helpful? Yes, actually very recently we started doing studies. This has been over the last few years. And one of the first populations that was targeted is patients with terminal diseases, terminal cancer. As we know, you can have an existential experience that can relieve your anxiety of dying or can relieve the anxiety of what's going on. When you take psychedelics, you may experience this alternative reality or alternative world, and you may hint things that may exist beyond your regular experience of senses in life. So they did one study in 2015 with LSD, and they did 6 to 8 psychotherapy sessions to prepare the persons. All of them had a stage 4 cancer, and after that they had 2 sessions of LSD. And what they found that is after 1 year, after they finished, everybody finished the study, 6 to 8 psychotherapy sessions, 2 sessions of LSD, and then we evaluate after 1 year. And after 1 year, they found that 77.8% they had reduction in anxiety. And these studies, they are phase 2 studies, so they do it for safety. Is it safe to give LSD? And in the meantime, we're going to measure anxiety and depression and so on, but they are just trying to measure safety. And they concluded that it was safe to give LSD to patients with terminal cancer, which is very intriguing because these patients are very sensitive. Many times they have a lot of metabolic abnormalities, and there was no fatalities, and people tolerated the medicine. We've tried also psilocybin, the mushrooms. What they call it, the magic mushrooms popularly, but the psilocybin, they take a dose of mushroom. There is a study from 2011 from JAMA Psychiatry. I met one of the authors casually going to the ACAP. I was talking about mushrooms to somebody, and they say, "Oh, I participated in the first study on mushrooms in psilocybin." And I met one of the participants in the study. So what they did is they took 12 patients that were volunteers. So there is a self-selection bias when you volunteer, because some people have had mushrooms in the past and they found it helpful. So we have this bias here. But 12 volunteers with people with stage 4 cancer, they did a double-blind crossover. So double-blind crossover means the 12 people get the mushrooms, but they don't know if they're on placebo or not. And after 3 months, the 12 people take the placebo. So you compare after the 12 people after taking the mushroom or the people after taking the placebo. Actually, in this study, what they did is 6 people taking the mushroom versus 6 people taking the placebo, and they compare, and then the other 6 who took the placebo, after that they did the mushroom. So the crossover also have limitations, because people could compare. Another limitation could be is that the people are still having a therapeutic effect. But nonetheless, they found that this study was helpful in decreasing anxiety and depression, and people find it helpful, and it was tolerable. Then Griffith, in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, studied 51 patients where he did a double-blind randomized crossover as well. So everybody eventually got the mushrooms, and they compared microdose versus high dose. So the placebo was a microdose. They were taking low dose of the mushrooms versus high dose of the mushrooms. So even in the placebo, there could be a therapeutic effect. And he found, this is very interesting, he found that at the time that they took the medicine, they took the session, the people that took the small dose, this is the improvement. This is the response rate. This is the people respond means a response in clinical trials means 60% improvement of the symptoms. So you get 60% improvement of the symptoms, you are responding to the medicine. Remission means almost 100% improvement of the symptoms. You know, it's important that we know about that. So this is the comparison of people who do the microdose versus the high dose. So much higher response rate in people who took the high dose. After 6 months, everybody had taken the drug, so we cannot compare because it was a crossover. After 6 months, the improvement was still there of response. So, I mean, what medicines do we have now in psychiatry that you give 1 dose with 1 session, and after 6 months you are still here? What do we have in psychiatry like that? We get 50% response in 3 weeks, and everybody is selling that the deal of psychiatry. So it's going to change psychiatry. So it's important that we compare to what we have. This is the remission of symptoms, total improvement. Compare the high dose with the small dose. Up to here, we have up to 60% remission rate. 60% remission rate? 60% with 1 dose? And after 6 months, even more. It could be like naturally people get better, naturally. And here we have anxiety. Anxiety response, so much higher. And the anxiety even after 12 months, even better. And I have to say, even 1 session can be just good enough for years. I had 1 session, I haven't done another one in 3 years, and I still thought it was meaningful for me, and I feel better about some psychological issues. And this is the anxiety remission after 6 months. Even after 6 months, even better than at the first dose. It could be because anxiety gets better, or it could be because people continue processing what they went through, and this continues to be meaningful. But I think these results are very encouraging, and I don't see any reason why we shouldn't continue to do research on this to get a better understanding. Can we have better medicines than what we have now? Maybe. Let's just do the research. And I think this is important that we continue to do research on this. Now there is a phase 3 going on in NYU. We are still waiting for the results to see if we can release. I think one of the problems is we don't have a patent. Nobody can get a patent on this. Nobody can make money of this. So ketamine was going on for 40 years. Now we're going with intranasal ketamine. And now even at Ross, where I work, everybody is talking about ketamine, and it's okay to give ketamine. And it's because in the end, the money is the boss. You know, so if you don't get a patent, who's going to give you money? I've been trying to get money for these studies, and nobody wants to give me money. As soon as there is a patent, everybody will give me money. So it can be helpful also, not only in cancer, the other studies were in patients with cancer. That is especially meaningful when a person has this death anxiety. But also in treatment-resistant depression. So this study was published at Lancet Psychiatry. Lancet Psychiatry came out 2 years ago, and it's already the 5th journal as per impact factor. In Lancet Psychiatry, they did 12 patients with treatment-resistant depression, and they got 2 oral doses, one of 10 and one of 25 milligrams, 7 days apart. And in those 2 oral doses, they found that all the patients improved. So we see the improvement in all the patients. And this was stable after 6 months. And this is treatment-resistant depression. These are people who have failed 2 clinical trials already, fair clinical trials, and they are getting this and they're improving of this. So I think this is very encouraging. It's open label, but it's very encouraging. Treatment-resistant depression is very difficult, as you know, and it's very hard in treatment-resistant depression to get a good placebo response. So I think despite being open label, I think it's pretty encouraging to find this data. Psilocybin has been tried for other things as well. Tobacco dependence. This is a study, open label as well, 15 patients, and after 6 month follow-up, there was 80% abstinence with only 1 session. 80% abstinence of tobacco. I mean, there was psychotherapy. In this session, they had psychotherapy as well. But I think it's a pretty good deal. For alcohol, an open label study as well. 9 patients, reduced craving, all of them had reduced craving. And I was reading the study yesterday, 50% of them reported not willing to drink anymore. This is just small studies, pilot studies with 9-12 patients, but the results are good enough so that we can do better research and double-blind studies, multiple sites, and getting more patients. And not only patients that are self-selecting themselves, but patients maybe that might have never tried mushrooms to see what's really going on and how therapeutic can this really be in the real life, in the real world. Of course, obsessive-compulsive disorder. These are non-selective serotonin agonists. We use clomipramine, fluvoxamine all the time for obsessive-compulsive disorder. Why not using a non-selective serotonin agonist? So they found that we have a study with 9 patients. And these 9 patients, they said that all of them had reduction in the J. Brown obsessive-compulsive scale. Between 23%, the lowest, the one that had the lowest reduce of symptoms, and 100%, some people went in remission. Some of these people, the 9 patients, went in remission after OCD. If you want to use fluvoxamine for OCD, how many people are going to go in full remission? I mean, Dr. Brown has some experience with this. Ayahuasca as well, we have 2 studies, and I'm almost finishing, don't worry. We have 2 studies. One of them is an open label with 6 patients. This is a brew that you take Harbin and DMT. You don't know what you're taking the proportion because it depends on the different brews. But in this study, they found this open label for 6 patients, and they found that there was a reduction in the Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale, which is the most common that you use in depression, at day 1, 7, and 21. And there is another study with 35 patients down in Brazil, where it was double-blind, controlled placebo, and these people have borderline personality disorder, most of them as well. So the placebo response initially in the first dose was as good as ayahuasca. You can say how in borderline, we use lamotrigine, we use things that there is no research, but people respond to that all the time. So the placebo response was very good. But after 7 days, the placebo was 27%, and the ayahuasca response was 64%. So after 7 days, the placebo is not going to be there having that effect anymore. And the people who had responded to placebo, they stopped responding to that placebo after 7 days. But the people who had taken the ayahuasca were still reporting improvement in the depressive symptoms. And now we want to do research with microdosing with psilocybin. We started a group, Dr. Brown and I in Chicago, called the Psychedelics and the Treatment of and the Future of Psychiatry in the meetup. And we are just asking the people. We got 770 people who joined the group, and it's people who are psychologists, therapists, lay people, students, and we are trying to figure out what's going on with psychedelics in society, what can we do to change society, thinking differently, so that we can do better research and we can get support from somewhere. And some of these people have taken microdoses of psilocybin as an antidepressant, people who had taken SSRIs, and they were not getting better on SSRIs, and by themselves they've been trying to take microdosing. So what you take is a very, very tiny dose, 0.3 milligrams, twice a week. So every 3 days you take the tiny dose. And these people report that this is helpful, even when they have not responded to SSRIs. So we want to do first a subjective reported study, collecting all this data, and after that, potentially, if we can get money from somewhere, because that has been a challenge over the last year, do a trial doing safety in outpatient, and also we would like to do a double-blind control, comparing microdosing of psilocybin with SSRIs, and see what is better. I don't want to see, is it better to give Prozac to the people, or is it better to give microdoses of psilocybin? What can be most helpful? So I think this is my last slide. This is our emails. I want to thank you all very much for your attention today and for waiting so long. We have all the morning, so we're happy here to stay with you to talk about any question that comes from the presentation. Thank you.
So residents are going to have an opportunity to meet with speakers after this next door. So with a limited amount of time for questions, I would ask for residents.
Ultra. And this, I mean, the unethical thing is like people didn't consent sometimes, and they didn't know what they were taking, so that there was unethical things. But for the most part, people were volunteers in the study, and they were taking LSD. So I think it was, well,
Well, I was going to say, talking about the unethical nature of it and how a lot of the subjects didn't know that they were going to be dosed, I think is probably what caused a lot of negative outcomes, right? Because getting back to the concept of set and setting, like if you're not expecting to have a very mystical experience, and all of a sudden just you're in a room and you're sitting down and you're talking, and then you're feeling like you're getting shot off into outer space, that's going to be very disorienting and cause some problems, and you're not going to understand what's going on if you didn't know what happened.
Unless you're on a bicycle.
Well,
the thing is, like, there was an informed consent violation, but other than that, I think it has been now portrayed as so negative. Like people say, oh, the CIA, because people like these conspiracies. Oh, the CIA was doing that, and that's so terrible. I was like, hey, slow down. I mean,
I don't know. I'm going to take the counterpoint to that, Dr. Espi. I think that you would want anybody to consent to anything you would give them. This is a big argument because some proponents of psychedelics, they say like, well, why don't we dose the water? right? You know, like just let's put some LSD in, everyone's gonna be able to open up and realize that we're all connected and we're all one human family together and everything's gonna be fantastic. I think that would be a huge recipe for disaster, actually, because again, people aren't gonna know what's going on, they're gonna freak out, they're probably gonna be like lashing out at others because like they're trying to defend themselves. Like if you're gonna become very, very vulnerable and very scared because like you're seeing like, you know, you're looking at someone's face and all of a sudden it's all looking all distorted. That's creepy. You know, like so I think that the whole MK Ultra thing, or at least the story I get out of it, yeah, it's interesting that they were doing research on it, but this is the reason why we have informed consent and the reason why you want to take these substances seriously and try to use them in the appropriate context, because if you use them in inappropriate context, you might have much more negative outcomes.
Thank you, gentlemen, for very interesting, stimulating